I got a comment, my favourite in a long time. The more I watch your newer short videos, the more they all support your LHFE 2.3 video, where Victor Hugo talks about how the people of his time were destroying the old buildings. They had the technology to build imitations, which you are demonstrating now in your short videos. Spot on, thank you. LHFE 2.3, where I discuss Victor Hugo, was my way in to presenting my revised thesis. And I planned to ease things as I went, slowly debunking my previous claims and refining my arguments. But it just was not feasible in terms of writing. My form was suffering too much, so I crashed it down. I think it's a good time to present my revised hypothesis in a series of short videos, starting with the overall plot. This hypothesis relies on the viewer understanding that structures between the medieval era to the present day were very possible for those in the history books to build. By accepting this, it opens up a whole new avenue of investigation in terms of historical erasure and fabrication. A quick caveat. I do acknowledge that there are impossible structures by what the narrative tells us. This is primarily the megalithic stuff, the pyramids, Baalbek, etc. I will reference these when appropriate, but they are slightly outside the scope of my current research. My focus is on the end of the Middle Ages, where I think a great population reset occurred and what I call the Great Transition, or Age of Transition, the period from 1400 to the 20th century. So let's start with the broader, more general plot. It most likely will not make immediate sense, but I will be following up with further short videos that explore aspects of it in more detail, so do not take it as truth. My objective is to try and turn the hypothesis into a theory, with a lot of supporting evidence in LLG and these short videos. If I need to make future adjustments and refinements to the thesis, then I will. The Middle Ages came to a tumultuous end with deliberately planned famine, plague, revolt and war. The world fell into temporary darkness at the hands of one of the most fatal depopulation events in history. It is estimated that the Black Death alone killed over half of the European and North African population, and over a third of the Middle East. It may have been more. Much of the social, economic and technological progression achieved in the Middle Ages suffered tremendously and came to a halt. In other words, there was a great population reset. The word reset means to return to a former condition. But in that darkness, a light began to stir and shine brighter and brighter. The light of Renaissance. Renaissance means rise again, or born again. Humanity began to recover, but something had forever changed. They did not repair and restore what was lost, but began to slowly build back better, in a very different direction. A direction that would dictate the course of history until the present day. A brave new age began, and the old medieval world began to fall slowly into obscurity. Why? Because during the traumatic upheaval at the end of the Middle Ages, an entity, a shadow syndicate, or synarchy if you will, rose again, seized power, and began implementing a plan that is still in action today. This entity has one goal: world domination. It is a malignant force, serving only itself and its agenda. It is the empire above all empires, Shadow Rome. It moves very slow and cunning like a snake, often hidden, shedding its skin wherever it goes. The characters that make up the anatomy of this entity, this creature, are not easily identified, but it does have a very distinctive modus operandi. It operates by infiltrating nation states. It uses large-scale staged events to further its agenda. It has orchestrated these events since the end of the Middle Ages, and continues to do so today. Every time it does, the plan slowly advances. One of its key trademarks is its religion, its worship of the light in all forms, especially the celestial light. Sometimes it will stage events that unfold like a human dramatization and personification of the movements of the celestial light above us. The eclipse is its crowning chess move. It will plunge the world into darkness. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. Only to then bring back the light, the saviours and their solutions that society embraces with open arms. Each time this happens, this entity slowly advances its agenda. When this entity initially rose to power, it had successfully plunged medieval society into the dark, famine and plague, and then restored the light with the Renaissance. It was one of the biggest dark to light eclipse moves in history, a great population reset. Humanity has been under the might and rule of this entity and its colonial prowess since then. The Renaissance marked the beginning of the Age of Transition, where the world shifted into modernity. For the first 400 years of this entity's reign, its primary goal was the implementation of globalization and in turn globalism, by connecting the world through trade, technology, religion, science and so on. It achieved this through infiltration, colonialism, slavery, industrialization, and war. Not everyone accepts change. Competitors for power arise. This entity had to protect itself and conquer with military and imperial force. It had to divide and conquer. It devised new methods of defense and attack. What is a star? Celestial light. Who worships the light? Your masters. Libertas, the sole invictus. Its other central primary objective was to erase and replace the history of the old medieval world. And one of the key ways it achieved this was by using architecture as a weapon of historical erasure. During the Renaissance, this entity devised a new style of architecture, named the New Classical. It did this by extracting stylistic elements of European Romanesque, Gothic, Middle Eastern and Moorish architecture and fusing them together. It has concealed this, and I plan to show you how. This entity then used this new classical style and pseudo-stonemasonry construction techniques to begin replacing the old medieval world, and in many instances, fabricating history. And it did so at a rapid pace. It began in Florence, and then spread across Europe, and then the rest of the world. If architecture ever held an alternative or esoteric function, it was lost and suppressed here during the Renaissance. If America has a greater hidden history, it was lost here. If Britain has a greater hidden history, it was lost here. This entity deliberately delayed the Industrial Revolution by 300 to 400 years, perhaps out of a fear of losing its position of power, perhaps to first let the population recover from the Black Death. The technology of the Industrial Revolution and its powerful potential did exist prior to the 1700s, but in a different form. When it was ready, this entity unleashed the industrial technology of steam power and used it to further strengthen its grip over the world through globalization and overt colonialism. It also uses technology to finalize its editing and erasure of medieval history. It continued to use the new classical style as a weapon of erasure, demolishing old sites and replacing them in this style. But it also seized upon the Gothic style to finalize its agenda. This was primarily undertaken through two operations, the Victorian Restoration and the Gothic Revival. The first consisted of restoring and thus editing, destroying and replacing most of the remaining medieval structures in Europe. The second operation, the Gothic Revival, worked by spreading the Gothic style in the form of new structures all over the world. Why? to instill and solidify in the minds of contemporary and future generations a preconception of what the medieval world looked like. It also used a new classical and Gothic revival as a means of cultural colonialism, subjugating entire nations to its own cultural expression, changing their religion, histories, education, mythology, and so on. This does not belong in India. The classical here does not belong in Singapore. It does not reflect their national expression. Here they are building a huge classical edifice in South Africa. Does this carry an African cultural inflection? Does it even belong in Britain? What about America? Eradicating heritage characterizes this entire period. The new classical is the architectural expression of this globalist entity and its colonial monomania. Does this mean every classical or Gothic structure built during the Age of Transition served the agenda to erase what came before? No, but a big portion of them did. The builders, the brickmakers, the stonemasons, the decorators, the carpenters, the labourers themselves were some of the most talented, hard-working, and incredible artists of all time. They were our ancestors, and their legacy is immortalized in these structures. Men, women, and children. Without a very sly and sinister form of child slavery, there would have been no industrial revolution. Empires are built on the backs of slaves. The workers, both free and enslaved, were the muscle and talent. The Brunelleschis, the Palladios, the Wrens, the Gilbert Scotts. These were the visionary directors, the governing hands that ensured structures were executed to certain specifications, ensuring that when they replaced or restored whatever was left of the old medieval world, that nothing remained that could betray their master's liberal rewriting of its history. This goal was achieved at the end of the 19th century, with developments in artificial and mass-produced templated stone. I think this is why we do not build like this today. We can do it, and sometimes an incredible cathedral or mosque will go up. But traditional architecture served its function, replacing what came before, or as Victor Hugo said, as he lamented the way the new classical had replaced his old medieval Paris. We wish to erase it all fully from our history. In April of 2019, Notre Dame Cathedral caught fire and burned for hours. It marked the 666th year since the Black Death ended, a fitting anniversary. It also marked the beginning of the next phase of this entity's plan. We are living through that right now. It looks like a fourth industrial revolution is coming. That's the plot. So there is continuity with this episode, but it's not compatible with the Tartaria impossible structures hypothesis. My current research is focused on locating moments of significant change and potential historical erasure in the Age of Transition, which I will present on and try to evidence in these two playlists. In the next video, I'm going to demonstrate, with specific examples, some different ways of exploring architecture, historical crisis events, and historical fabrication in light of this hypothesis.
Raiden, are you receiving? We're still here.
How's that possible? The AI was destroyed.
Only GW.
Who are you?
To begin with, we're not what you'd call human. Over the past 200 years, a kind of consciousness formed layer by layer in the crucible of the White House. It's not unlike the way life started in the oceans 4 billion years ago. The White House was our primordial soup, a base of evolution. We are formless. We are the very discipline and morality that Americans invoke so often. How can anyone hope to eliminate us? As long as this nation exists, so will we.
Cut the crap! If you're immortal, why would you take away individual freedoms and censor the net?
Jack, don't be silly.
Don't you know that our plans have your interests, not ours, in mind?
What?
Jack, listen carefully, like a good boy.
The mapping of the human genome was completed early this century. As a result, the evolutionary log of the human race lay open to us.
We started with genetic engineering, and in the end, we succeeded in digitizing life itself.
But there are things not covered by genetic information.
What do you mean?
Human memories, ideas, culture, history.
Genes don't contain any record of human history.
Is it something that should not be passed on? Should that information be left at the mercy of nature?
We've always kept records of our lives, through words, pictures, symbols, from tablets to books.
But not all the information was inherited by later generations. A small percentage of the whole was selected and processed, then passed on. Not unlike genes, really.
That's what history is, Jack.
But in the current digitized world, trivial information is accumulating every second, preserved in all its triteness, never fading, always accessible.
Rumors about petty issues, misinterpretations, slander.
All this junk data, preserved in an unfiltered state, growing at an alarming rate.
It will only slow down social progress, reduce the rate of evolution.
Right. You seem to think that our plan is one of censorship.
Are you telling me it's not?
You're being silly. What we propose to do is not to control content, but to create context.
Create context?
The digital society furthers human flaws and selectively rewards development of convenient half-truths. Just look at the strange juxtapositions of morality around you.
Billions spent on new weapons in order to humanely murder other humans.
Rights of criminals are given more respect than the privacy of their victims.
Although there are people suffering in poverty, huge donations are made to protect endangered species. Everyone grows up being told the same thing.
Be nice to other people.
But beat out the competition.
You're special. Believe in yourself and you will succeed.
But it's obvious from the start that only a few can succeed.
You exercise your right to freedom, and this is the result. All rhetoric to avoid conflict and protect each other from hurt. The untested truths, spun by different interests, continue to churn and accumulate in the sandbox of political correctness and value systems.
Everyone withdraws into their own small gated community, afraid of a larger forum. They stay inside their little ponds, leaking whatever truth suits them into the growing cesspool of society at large.
The different cardinal truths neither clash nor mesh. No one is invalidated, but nobody is right.
Not even natural selection can take place here. The world is being engulfed in truth.
And this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper.
Metal Gear Solid 2 was released in 2001 and prophesized our current era, in which we find ourselves on the brink of another industrial revolution and in the fog and haze of information warfare. The word truth has become an economy unto itself. It has lost its sovereignty, and we are flooded, day in, day out, 24 hours a day, with seemingly contradictory truths. The next genius move of the entity, to completely destabilize our perception of reality. But a question remains: how did a video game in 2001 predict our current era of social media and digitized information warfare so accurately before Google, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram were invented? The most sensible answer is that the technology of the digital world was developed in secret many years before it was unleashed onto the public. But is that a reasonable hypothesis? Could technology really be developed in secret and subsequently given to the public later under the guise of invention, innovation and business? And if so, has technology always been developed secretly behind the scenes? The ruins of Rievaulx Abbey. The medieval monasteries of Britain suffer from a kind of cliché misrepresentation, a distorted preconditioned image perpetrated by the entity. We think of monks dressed in wool, living in quiet solitude, toiling in their fields and attending structured prayer. This could not be further from the truth, and it doesn't help that they are all in ruin. Rievaulx was a massive site, including more than 70 outbuildings and covering 100 square miles of Yorkshire. Now only the abbey remains in ruins, but there were many factories in its jurisdiction. And in 1997, archaeologists and geophysicists found something remarkable. They set out to investigate 13th century iron making techniques, using extremely sophisticated magnetometers and fluxgate gradiometers. What they found, as William Rosen states, caused quite a stir in the world of technological history. They found an abundance of residual magnetism around the site. It suggested that the furnaces in use during the 13th century at just one of the abbey's iron smelters were producing iron at a level of technical sophistication equivalent to that of 18th century Britain. The newspapers at the time declared that King Henry VIII's dissolution and destruction of the monasteries in the 1500s delayed the Industrial Revolution by 2 centuries. But they were producing this level of iron in the 1200s, and Rievaulx is just one site. It's not the largest. Fountains Abbey and Furness Abbey were much bigger. Interesting name that, Furness. There were over 800 monastic sites in Britain alone. Perhaps it was the Black Death in the 1300s that truly delayed the Industrial Revolution. It certainly would have slowed progress. There is an abundance of evidence that suggests these were Christian sites, but Rievaulx is also evidence that these monasteries were much more, and that the Industrial Revolution was on track to happen much earlier in the historical timeline. But a question remains, where did all that technological knowledge and infrastructure go? The monasteries are in ruin, their contents are missing, either stolen, buried, or reused. It would not surprise you if I told you that the internet, in its pre-form, was invented at DARPA, the US Department of Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It was developed in secret before being launched to the world. But would it surprise you if I told you that the steam engine shared a similar story? In 1639, the government-run Royal Office of Ordnance had been expanded to include part of an ancient estate, Vauxhall. Vauxhall was a place of resort for artists, mechanics, and where experiments and trials of profitable inventions should be carried on. Or as Rosen states, it was a sort of 17th century equivalent of DARPA. The steam engine in question was invented by a military engineer here, and developed for the sole purpose of pumping water. A new invention for raising any quantity of water to any height by the help of fire alone. This is in the mid-1600s, a steam engine being developed by the military in secret way before the Industrial Revolution. This is direct evidence that significant technologies have been developed in their pre-forms by military engineers for centuries before our modern era. And given the extremely high levels of magnetism discovered at Rievaulx, it begs the question, is there a connection between the technology lost at the end of the Middle Ages and the military? Where did the engineering infrastructure that was once present at these monastic sites go? Is there a relationship between these sites and steam? Was technology one of the real reasons they were destroyed by Henry, under the guise of politics and a divorce? Were their contents secretly absorbed into the military? Finding evidence of secret military involvement in repurposing technology of the Middle Ages is not going to be easy. Documents would have likely been handwritten, archived under top secret, or destroyed. But in my search for evidence, I found something quite different, but more startling. They say the devil's in the detail, There is a slight misconception that architecture, canals, bridges and so on are the sole product of civil engineering, of innovative architects, hard-working citizens and slaves. That's just one part of the story. There is another side to the story that's been greatly overlooked and, in many cases, buried. Since the beginning of the Age of Transition, construction technology and engineering methods were one of the best kept secrets of the European military. In his article on British military engineers in 19th century India, John Weiler states, surprisingly, this significant historical phenomenon has been barely explored by scholars. And I'm not surprised, because as I have come to learn, military engineering from the 1400s to the 1700s operated through the tacit transfer of technological knowledge. Tacit means silent, unspoken. It means secret. And one of the greatest secrets of the military during the Age of Transition was cement and concrete. It was treated like precious gold. Formal and technical documentation on hydraulic cement doesn't really appear until the 1750s. But as scholar Chandra Mukherjee explains, in 1670, the entrepreneur for the Canal du Midi imported pozzolan from Italy to make hydraulic mortar. Pozzolan is the key ingredient in Roman concrete. He did so under the recommendation of the French military engineer Louis-Nicolas de Clerville. And Mukherjee asked a series of vital questions. How was hydraulic mortar remembered and used before its rediscovery? How did they know where to acquire the ingredients? How did they mix their cement? None of this is documented. It was developed in secret. The technique for using it was not formally recorded, so it was preserved tacitly, not in texts, but in practice. As Mukherjee explains, secrecy was a key virtue in soldiers. Military engineers had vast libraries of manuscript maps that they kept concealed rather than published. Clerville protected secrets in his engineering, in his devices for the canal and other structures. Clerville's successor, military engineer Sebastian Vauban, started to have concerns. Because soldiers live short lives, there was a risk of losing expertise when soldiers died. So he began recording a little of this tacit, secret technological knowledge. One record details a recipe for hydraulic cement. Lime, sand and pozzolan or pulverized brick pass through a baker's basket, 2/5 of lime with 3/5 of sand, and so on. What is striking is that this formula differs from others that scarcely appear in the historical record. It is a novel formula. It was passed on and developed purely in secret. And this practice of secret and advanced military methods of construction did not cease once formal documentation on cement arose during the 1700s. As John Wheeler explains, the 19th century British military engineers were well ahead of their civil engineer countrymen in establishing a significant presence in foreign territories. British engineers moved into foreign lands from the late 1830s, carrying with them the influences of advanced technology. Engineers were active in India from the mid-18th century as a separate branch of the army in the service of the East India Company. British military engineers were well underway in the Caribbean in 1700s, in India, Canada, in Western Australia. During the period 1851 to 1856, Royal Engineers undertook a variety of experiments. In India, experimentation with limes, cements and concrete led the way. They developed magnesia cement, more accurately described as natural hydraulic cement made from magnesian limestone. They were also setting up a whole range of prefabricated structures. In another article, Todd Charlotte informs us that America's oldest and largest construction agency was the Corps of Engineers. They built massively and with great precision, and part of their knowledge also relied on the person-to-person, word-of-mouth transfer of technological knowledge from industrial Europe. Again, the transfer of tacit or secret military engineering knowledge. Why is this important? Firstly, this demonstrates that there was a military-industrial complex of engineers dealing in secret with undisclosed and experimental technologies during the Age of Transition. There is enough evidence to classify this as a theory. The military has always been at the forefront of technological innovation. It goes back to the Republic of Venice at the end of the Middle Ages, where in this department all types of instruments and machines are constantly being constructed. But the highly secretive manner when it comes to concrete is startling. They were not this careful when it came to the steam engine. That is documented. So why was something like concrete guarded so carefully? And to what extent did they develop and use it? Wouldn't sharing this knowledge benefit all societies immensely? You could argue it was to stop other nation-state militaries from stealing techniques and gaining advantage. But let's hypothesize a bit more. What if all militaries were unknowingly controlled and under the rule and might of the entity? Do you know what you can do with cement and concrete, especially cast concrete? It's common knowledge that the ancient Romans built with brick and concrete. The Pantheon, Colosseum, Temple of Saturn are all concrete. When the empire fell, concrete largely disappeared until the Renaissance, a very peculiar and abrupt period of discontinuity, 1,000 years. Great Pyramid K 2019 provides ample evidence that the Great Pyramid and Sphinx are concrete. This has also been verified from other sources. What if the entity, through its military-industrial complex, began using secret, tacit engineering technology during the Age of Transition to construct and modify many structures? What if some were assigned to earlier dates in the timeline? What if the real history of Rome was deliberately buried, and Shadow Rome took its place, and, influenced by Egyptian methods of construction, began fabricating these ruins out of artificial stone? Could many ruins be artificial? Have you noticed how many classical sites also feature obelisks? Have you ever heard of the Renaissance book hunters, of Poggio Bracciolini in particular? Was the history of the Imperial Roman Empire rewritten in order for Shadow Rome to assert itself politically? To cultivate fashions among citizens, so they blindly began replacing their medieval heritage in the classical style? And to what extent has undocumented artificial stone technology been used to erase, change, and replace structures that came before? But then there is a problem of storing and developing these technologies in secret, especially during the early periods of the Age of Transition. Where would they do that, and with what workforce? What is a fortification? A defensive measure in times of warfare? Yes, but also an impenetrable stronghold, perhaps a place to develop technology in secret, a sanctuary to store the hidden, perhaps even a prison to keep slaves, a formidable fortress that is not easy to enter or escape from. Where did the technological infrastructure of Revo go? A star, light. Who worships the light? And could some of these be connected to pre-Renaissance dumbs, deep underground tunnels? Metal Gear Solid 2, a prophetic warning. I'm sure this entity is reveling in the curious, entertaining the idea that the people of the past could not build these structures. Perhaps it doesn't want us looking too closely and seeing the facades, the cement, the stucco, the scagliola, the code stone, the terracotta. The artificial stone that's everywhere, and how easy they could do it. Perhaps it wants us to think that this all belonged to an advanced civilization and not look into the archives, to not find the stone-cutting machines, the concrete formulas, to not question the tacit secrecies of its military force. Metal Gear Solid told us in advance the next genius move of this entity. It is using digital information warfare to encourage the organism of society to participate in an act of propagating contradictory truths, enticing them into believing everything is a lie, to select what truths are worthy and what are not. It's tricking you into erasing the past. We are in a transitory phase where the book is slowly dying and the automated, digitalized realm of information technology reigns supreme. The book is its rival, and the book is losing. Why consult the library when you can ask Google? Why read and try to discern what's true and what's not when you can just say it's all fake? At first, this entity collected the book in its arms, in its digitalized archives and libraries. I'll keep you safe, it said. But it now overwhelms the individual with contradictory truths, destabilizing their received notions of reality. And perhaps eventually it will begin to slowly change the information in its digitalized archives. This will be the moment it slays its rival for good, and a rewriting of mankind's history will begin. And I think it's done it before. Before the book was the primary chronicle, there existed another great script of mankind's history. A script written in stone. Let me try and show you how it was potentially rewritten. From now on, things are about to become quite worrying. Something is wrong. Something doesn't feel natural. When the entity set out to rewrite history during the age of transition, controlling and changing the printed word would not be enough. It's one thing to rewrite narrative, but in doing so, the physical world needs to change in line with it. The medieval temples of India. Ruined, decimated, and then restored in the 19th century. Who restored them? The west facade of Lichfield Cathedral, mid-restoration. Today a multitude of cast statues reside in these niches. They tell Britain's history. Were there other statues present here before restoration? Did they tell a different story? The cathedrals, the ships of Theseus, the multitude of changes, making it almost impossible to understand the structure's original language. But the architectural changes are just one kind. There is a lot more to this story of revision and erasure. And before we turn to architecture, we must chase a different rabbit. And it's worth knowing that this burrow goes so deep, it unsettles. Something is wrong, and it's tremendously worrying. In our current digital age, we are bombarded by the constant haze and hum of blue artificial light and unclean electromagnetic frequencies. During our free time, it's good to get away from it all. If you live in a country like England, you are almost spoilt for choice. Vast and sprawling parklands belonging to the country's heritage estates are found in abundance, in their hundreds. Chatsworth, Blenheim, Trentham, Shugborough, Clumber, Woollerton, Weston. It's the weekend and it's good to get away from it all. Out into the parks, a breath of fresh air, a spot of exercise strolling around their vast lakes, a picnic on the grass, back in nature, rejuvenating, reconnecting. But something is wrong. Something doesn't feel natural. And that's because it isn't. For you see, the majority of England's enormous, sprawling country estate gardens and landscapes are not what they seem. They are artificial. Meet Lancelot Brown, otherwise known as Capability Brown. During the 1700s, Brown was responsible for redesigning over 170 of the finest country homes and parklands in the United Kingdom, many of which survive today. Brown's signature style was so influential that a wealth of other landscape designers adopted his vision and continued to redesign hundreds more. Capability Brown has become a household name. His landscaping design changed the country so much that he is now referred to as the Shakespeare of gardens. He was a leading frontman for the entity, setting in motion a fashion that would obliterate England's medieval heritage. Beware of fashions. They are often catalysts for control. And from the 1400s to the 1800s, the classical style of architecture was all the rage. Sneaky classical. It wasn't enough just to be popular, was it? You had to smear your rival. The insipid taste of Gothic ornamentation, these odious monstrosities of an ignorant age, produced by the torrents of barbarism. You see, to encourage society to warm to and embrace a revived classical style, and to use it to replace their medieval heritage, propaganda like this was necessary. Means of disseminating propaganda were limited in the 1700s, but one of the key ways this was achieved was through literature. Literature was the equivalent of our television shows, and it was English poet Alexander Pope who helped ensure that the elite and wealthy wanted to spend their money destroying the majority of medieval estates in the UK and renewing them in the classical style. Pope promoted the idea of following ancient or classical principles in the garden as well as in architecture. In 1711, in his essay on criticism, he wrote, "Learn hence for ancient rules just esteem. To copy nature is to copy them." What does that mean? To copy nature is to copy them. Prior to Capability Brown, the large manorial estates found across Britain were designed and adhered to a formal geometry. The gardens follow precise geometric formations, straight-lined avenues, canals, walled spaces, and tiered terraces, much like we see here at Powys Castle. Much like we see here in this plan. It was all about geometry, and they had to go. As one of the propagandists wrote at the time, "The natural garden will make his design submit to nature, and not nature to his design." Capability Brown and his contemporaries removed avenues, parterres, terraces, basins and canals, everything partaking of the old art and geometry from the environs of great houses. In their place, they laid out what we now describe as landscape parks, informal and natural in character, eschewing straight lines and formal geometry. This was Chatsworth House in the 1600s. This is it today. Brownian landscapes can be characterized by the following. They consist of vast, uninterrupted stretches of land, merging the garden with the landscape beyond, punctuated by irregular clumps of woodland and trees. Thousands upon thousands of trees were moved and planted for this effect. An immense amount of earth was moved to smooth the landscape, to create hills, to cover the medieval landscape that existed before it. Straight lines were everywhere replaced by curves and sinuosity. To not obstruct the view of the greater landscape from the house, formal walls were removed and inverted. This is a ha-ha. It is an inverted wall or sunken wall. From the perspective of the house, it gives a continuous, uninterrupted view. And from the outside of the house, it prevents any livestock from entering this area. Finally was the redesign of the landscape's water networks. Their previous geometric formations were replaced with irregular bodies of water. Artificial lakes and serpentine rivers were created instead, curving through the greater landscape like a snake. These characteristics define the Brownian landscape, and his style was immensely influential and was widely copied, so that many hundreds of landscape parks had appeared in England by the time of his death, and still exist today. As this map shows, Brown sites alone covered almost the entirety of the country. You see this landscape, from the clusters of trees, to the smooth gradients of hills, to the woodland borders beyond, and the serpentine river and lake. It is all artificial. It was all man-made in the 1700s and carefully constructed to look this way. And I know what you want to say. What? There is no way. But I'm not lying. Longleat and its gardens. In their analysis of Longleat's contracts, David Brown and Tom Williamson tell us that they describe how terraces were to be levelled, land drained, and walls removed, various basins and canals filled in or deformalised, and trees and shrubs planted, and gravel walks laid out. A ha-ha was to be constructed, and modifications made to the existing serpentine water so that its sharp turns were removed. Horace Walpole visited Chatsworth in 1761. His journal tells how they were widening and raising the river and carrying the park onto the side of it and levelling a great deal of ground to show the river. The estate accounts record regular payments to Michael Milliken, Brown's associate, for moving earth. The accounts for Harewood at the time reveal that workmen were engaged to remove a vast hill to the south of the house, and this project went on for 10 years, using 10 to 45 labourers. This is the south view of Harewood. It's man-made. All Brown's landscapes are artificial. For all their supposedly natural appearance, Williamson writes, Brown's lakes were alien impositions on the landscape, often being highly engineered. The process of creating these features was often the largest and most technically demanding of any earthwork operation. A significant body of water would need to be penned, and the level maintained through the year. In some sites, Brown reshaped extensive topography and diverted rivers to create the shape of the water feature. Manipulation of the water was achieved through a variety of means. The most simple method was erecting a dam across a watercourse so that water was ponded back behind it. They would build an earthen embankment dam, dig out sections, and shape the edges of the lake to create an ideal form. Some dams were large, up to 210 meters long. Where the geology for creating lakes was impermeable, a measure of puddling with clay was sometimes required to ensure that the lake held water. This method of rammed clay or puddling creates a watertight material that offsets water permeability and was used in the construction of canals. When there was no natural watercourse available, where rivers were absent, artificial ones would be created by the use of valleys and damming of streams. If such natural resources were lacking, then artificial lakes could be constructed instead. Brown would engineer these artificial lakes to be fed from a number of small streams and springs. Several sites contained a pre-existing water body, typically a canal or fish pond, which Brown expanded and reshaped into long lakes. Often a complex and extensive system of channels and culverts would be created to mitigate any risk of flooding. Brown created drainage systems, parallel sets of underground brick-built barrel drains, to ensure land would not become waterlogged. Damp moory ground, despite its location in the park, was removed. A certain mindset developed. If it could not be so improved, it should be drowned if possible beneath the waters of a lake. I hope you understand the enormity of Brown's activities, the vast amount of earth moving required to achieve this vision. Capability Brown, the Shakespeare of gardens, the great earth mover. It is almost unfathomable, and it characterized a majority of engineering construction throughout the 1700s. Did you know that for outside of a few limited areas, few water bodies of any size actually existed in lowland England at the start of Brown's career? Now there are huge lakes thanks to Brown. He remodeled the entire landscape of lowland England. Something is wrong. Something doesn't feel natural. The great earth mover. And what is earth? Soil. Mud. But how on earth was this the product of one man? How was Brown so capable that he reshaped England like this, especially during the 1700s? The lone entrepreneur and genius visionary is a story, A narrative. This was not the product of one man. That's the lie, the cover story. This was nothing less than a nationwide operation, carried out by hundreds, if not thousands of individuals. Operation Capability Brown. Operation Earth Mover. And before we look at who the Earth Movers were, it is necessary to highlight what the purpose of this operation was. Two objectives. The first of which would cause, as scholar Jonathan Finch has noted, the final obliteration of the earlier medieval manorial complex and its landscape. As Williamson also confirms for us, Brown's landscapes erased all signs of earlier history, as well as all aspects of local character. In some sense, they were earth sculptures. They have caused an archaeological lacuna, devoid of earthwork traces of the pre-park landscape. A lacuna is an empty space, an absence, a missing part. Some remains of the previous medieval landscape are traceable, but most of it has been muted or obliterated. And not only have ecologists, geologists, landscape experts studied Brown's landscapes and confirmed their artificialness, but recent excavations at Harewood House revealed part of the manorial complex, and, critically, the earth moving enacted by Brown and his men to erase the site from view. Very little worked stone was recovered from the site, indicating it was reused elsewhere on the estate, and the voids which have been left within the building were first filled with large pieces of rubble from the demolished building. The whole site was then covered with a demolition layer of rubble pieces, broken bricks, and a considerable amount of plaster or lime, within which was mixed discarded ceramic and glassware. The demolition layer was spread across the site. Obliterated, erased, our medieval history now a lacuna. Andrew Wild informs us that Brown compromised very little, sometimes destroying ancient avenues of fine trees, magnificent old yew hedges, and even historic mansions. In their place, Brown created scenes of sweeping turf, often covering hundreds of acres. Destroyed, buried. And listen to this. Sometimes the radical nature of Brown's work drew criticism, as in the case of Roche Abbey, where he grasped over the outline of the abbey ruins, leaving only the upright fragments rising from a bowling green lawn. It wasn't enough to remodel pretty much the entire English landscape. They were burying the monasteries that were already in ruin, destroyed 2 centuries before. Williamson really hits home the message of just how enormous and unfathomable this level of historical erasure was when he states, "What is so striking about such endeavours is that until we are told that this great effort has been made, we would often not know it." The second objective of Operation Capability Brown was, in some ways, even darker. To create these vast landscape parks in the 1700s, Parliament passed Enclosure Acts. This meant that suddenly, the land surrounding these sites no longer belonged to the common people. Their rights of access were removed, and fields were enclosed by hedges, walls, or fences. In other words, it enabled the portion of land belonging to the elites to expand and absorb everything around it. The enclosure bills amounted to 6,800,000 acres, or 1/5 of the total area of England. This caused a widespread displacement of people. It affected small-time farmers, villages, and eradicated a whole history of localized culture. Wild informs us that the enclosure involved the removal of communal rights, controls, or ownership over a piece of land, and enabled the total control of a vast acreage, which could be used for grand designs. This gave Brown and others power to change entire villages. For instance, at Milton Abbas, where he was involved with the clearance and rebuilding of the village. In some cases, many were destroyed. A substantial hamlet of Bowood in Wiltshire was removed when the park was laid out and partly drowned beneath the lake. Not only did it allow the powers that be to erase historical sites, but also stifled any chance of the lower classes maintaining localized prosperity. The world was changing, the Industrial Revolution was happening, workforce was needed elsewhere in different industries. It changed so many people's lives and displaced their heritage. And it's still unfathomable and hard to conceptualize just how much of England's history and landscape they managed to change during 1 century. And I cannot emphasize it enough as to just how big a single one of these artificial landscape parks are. As a frontman, Capability Brown gets all the credit, but he was just one landscaping leader operating within this larger Operation Earthmover. And a closer look at the historical literature and his records tell us everything we need to know. Contemporary correspondence makes it clear that Brown usually made no more than 4 visits each year to a particular site, often fewer. It was, rather, Brown's very capable associates who were responsible for much of what was created in his name. Brown's records show that by 1768, his profits had risen to £32,279, equivalent to many millions of pounds today, and that among his clients were half of the House of Lords. But they also show that there were many subcontractors, utilised to carry out his designs, highly skilled individuals that often supplied their own labour force. Subcontracting gave Brown the flexibility to respond to demand across the country. It enabled him to create a national landscaping business and rapid expansion. But as Williamson notes, Brown's books throw up a host of other names about whom relatively little is known. Many were apparently gardeners or nurserymen who were recruited locally, but who often then remained for many years in Brown's service. These were Brown's army of foremen, who he relied on to implement his plans to a high standard without close supervision. Men were recruited from varied backgrounds by these foremen. Sometimes estate labour was used to implement some or all of a design. Sometimes local labour was directly recruited. There were cohorts of surveyors and draftsmen ready to service the expanding market. The foremen often went on to become successful themselves, as was the case with Thomas White. He and his son went on to landscape more than 200 estates in Yorkshire and Scotland. Brown's foremen were trusted to such a high degree that when they encountered issues and had to change plan, they did so without Brown's approval. One account reports having to make a body of water 90 feet wider than Brown's original plan, of which the foreman concluded, "I think it will look well." As Finch writes, this is important evidence because it clearly shows that Brown's foreman was confident and trusted enough to take the initiative and had the ability to achieve Brown's overall vision, even when it meant adapting his plans. It also shows that the foremen were confident taking risks and not consulting Brown, even though they were working on estates that belonged to the country's most elite. Whoever these foremen or subcontractors were, they were trusted, knew exactly what they were doing, and were able to employ workforces readily. The whole thing reads like a tightly controlled inside job. Absences abound, in which the details are kept under lock and key. Even researchers acknowledge that there remain questions about how projects were approached, organised and directed, and it appears that a strategy of following the money is not going to provide us with the required understanding, as there are too many missing links. But when we dig more and look a little closer, we find a curious clue. In his analysis of Brown's remodelling of Harewood House and its landscape, Finch informs us that a year before Brown's first visit, a John Wooler of Whitby visited, producing a detailed design. Who was John Wooler? Well, originally a military engineer who had worked on several projects in the northeast. Aha, gotcha. If there was a significant and burgeoning landscaping industry, most of which was headed up by Brown, what is a former military engineer doing visiting sites and producing plans? Interestingly, when discussing the burial of the former medieval site at Harewood, Finch notes that the depth at which it was buried was considerably less than recommended by contemporaries and may reflect the urgency of the operation. Is that why a military engineer paid a visit? Was there an urgency to erase this site? It raises questions. Was the military involved at other sites? Was there a force above Brown orchestrating and directing this operation? Was secret or tacit military engineering technology used in re-landscaping the entire nation? A 1773 Act of Parliament suggests that something secret was certainly occurring. Parliament established a mechanism of road closure orders, creating perimeter belts around these sites, and which served to provide a measure of seclusion and privacy, as did the lodges which were erected at the gates of the larger parks. Parks removed the homes of local people and the fields of their labour from the polite gaze. Contracts drawn up when parks were created are sometimes quite explicit in this. They diverted and closed footpaths and roads. They wanted to be hidden. Was this to hide secret military involvement? Or perhaps to hide the act of heritage destruction? Perhaps they buried a lot more than we know at these sites while re-landscaping. And if you're having doubts about whether this wide-scale re-landscaping of England was indeed an operation, then consider this. These parks look like this today, but at the time they would have looked very different. Not only would each job take decades, but for a long time the earth would have been without grass. Most of the trees would have been very small. As Lady Shelburne wrote at the time, Brown's plantations were very young but promising. It's generally accepted that many illustrations of the time imagined how the sites would look in the future. 18th century landscape gardens can now be experienced at a level of maturity that was never possible when they were first landscaped and planted. As trees have grown and matured, these gardens have taken on an appearance that their creators could only have imagined. What would it take to live on a construction site for most of your life, and to pay the landscaper significant sums of money to do so? Did Parliament bribe the elite with the Enclosure Act, allowing them to own more farmland and with the promise of a big return in the agriculture business in exchange for years of re-landscaping? If so, who was directing Parliament to do this? And why is Operation Capability Brown important? 1. It provides us with direct evidence that a tremendous portion of England's landscape is not natural, but was artificially created during the 18th century. Geologists, ecologists, landscape researchers, and archaeological evidence of cement layering all confirm this. 2. It provides us with evidence that there was an agenda to erase England's medieval history. It was destroyed and buried. Its water systems were reconfigured and the architecture was replaced in the classical Roman style. It also provides us with another instance of military involvement in construction. And 3. Brown's landscapes provide us with hard evidence of earth moving and earth sculpture on an enormous and unfathomable scale. And it's this final point that has greater and more worrying implications. Something is wrong. Something doesn't feel natural. For years and years, archaeologists have dug through the earth, clearing the mud, on the hunt for the remains of previous civilizations, on a quest to uncover traces of history. Was centuries of soil accumulation always an accepted theory? In our present era of contradictory truths, the curious challenge this assumption. What if it isn't soil accumulation, but the results of a cataclysm, perhaps a mud flood? What unsettles you more, viewer? A cataclysm, or a deliberate, wide-scale and almost unfathomable burial at the hands of man itself? Don't you find it curious that many archaeological discoveries occurred during the 19th century and after? What if the landscape at some of these sites was deliberately engineered this way? Deliberately sculpted, deliberately buried? What if they aren't as old as we think they are? If you came to England and walked these parks, would you know they were artificial? Were these parks designed like this to stop archaeologists digging in these locations? Has an operation like this occurred elsewhere and in an undisclosed manner? It's very interesting that the ground seems raised in many specific locations around the world. But this is not the same, and compared to Brown's landscapes it seems child's play. Something is wrong, and it's tremendously worrying. The Earth Movers, our buried history. I'd like to show you something that might surprise you. This new classical style of architecture is a later rendition of the Palladian form. It is one of the most prevalent styles found throughout the Brown parklands. A classical estate, summoning the spirit of Rome. They replaced the medieval sites that once existed in these very locations. But look closer. Really look. Can you see it? A hidden message encoded into the architecture itself that perhaps only those in the know can truly understand. The bottom layer of this later Palladian style often features rustication masonry. Like Brown's gardens themselves, rustication masonry creates the illusion of authenticity. The blocks are supposed to look rustic, antique, old, but they have been purposefully crafted this way. A symbolic and coded message in the architecture itself. The rustication here symbolizes the old, the former, the past. A hidden in plain sight, mocking gesture to its medieval predecessor. We built ourselves on top of you, on top of the old. We now own the land, and you exist beneath us, and we will continue to dominate and squash you into the very ground below until you are no longer visible and belong to ancient history. They are telling us we know what's beneath because we buried it. And is that a stretch? Looking for coded messages in all styles of architecture.
Because they're often packed with religious codes and messages. So the first thing you notice with this entrance porch is that it's got 5 sides to the bay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And each side is 5 foot long. 3, 4, 5. 5 times 5, 25. That symbolizes the 25th of December, Christ's birthday, and the 25th of March, the date of the Annunciation to the Virgin Mary.
Perhaps it's not a stretch after all. And it really seems that the classical is full of symbolism and hidden messages. Blenheim, one of Capability Brown's finest landscapes. But look at the palace's ceiling, the all-seeing eye, the eye of the entity. I think it's time we took a closer look at this classical style and how it rose again. A lie is like a seed. Once planted, it will either thrive or fail. Lying can be convenient, prosperous, even necessary. But how many think about the seeds they plant? When planting a yew tree, would someone consider that they would die before they see it reach maturity? How after 1,000 years, the tangled roots and branches of that same tree may have spread to forever change the ecosystem around it. Lies are like seeds. Once planted, they can outlive and outpace a liar. What might seem inconsequential in the present can have grand consequences as time unfolds. A lie can change history forever. But it's the lies that resist exposure that are most troublesome. When you know someone is lying but you cannot irrefutably prove it. You feel it in your core, but it is your instinct against their word. What would that sort of lie do to the course of history and time?
Human memories, ideas, culture, history.
We've always kept records of our lives, through words, pictures, symbols, from tablets to books.
But not all the information was inherited by later generations. A small percentage of the whole was selected and processed, then passed on. Not unlike genes, really.
That's what history is, Jack.
During the Middle Ages, reading and writing were skills very few possessed. There were not public libraries stacked full of books and accessible by the majority like there is today. Most of the historical books were kept in monasteries. European monasteries were vast complexes managed by Christian monks, whose lives were ones divided by worship and hard labour in managing the self-sufficiency of the site. But reading was also a priority for monks, so much so that it was integrated into monastic rules, ensuring a duty to see that no brother is to waste time or engage in idle talk to the neglect of his reading. And, as scholar Stephen Greenblatt states, this obligatory reading was enough to set in motion an extraordinary chain of consequences. For a problem soon arose. Reading required books. Books that were opened again and again eventually fell apart, however carefully they were handled. In the absence of a commercial book market, monastic rules began to insist that monks not only learn to make parchment, but also transcribe and copy texts by hand. As one Benedictine monastic rule reads, "He who does not turn up the earth with the plough ought to write the parchment with his fingers." This was the beginning of the scriptoria, or scriptoriums. More and more monasteries aimed to hold a vast collection of books in their libraries. Fashioned with clear glass windows for optimal light, scriptoriums were workshops where monks sat for hours copying text. Producing parchment was laborious. Since paper did not come into general use until the 14th century, for more than 1,000 years the chief writing material used for books was made from the skins of animals. Good parchment was far too valuable and scarce to be discarded. And this value placed upon parchment helps to account for the fact that monasteries collected ancient pagan manuscripts and did not consign them to the rubbish.
Italians had been obsessed with book hunting for the better part of a century, ever since the poet and scholar Petrarch brought glory on himself around 1330 by piecing together the history of Rome and finding forgotten masters by Cicero, Propertius, and others. Petrarch's achievement had inspired others to seek out lost classics that had been lying unread, often for centuries. The recovered texts were copied, edited, commented upon, and eagerly exchanged, forming the basis for what became known as the study of humanities. The humanist, as those who were devoted to this study were called, knew from carefully poring over the texts that had survived from classical Rome that many once famous books, or parts of books, were still missing. The humanists knew that some of these missing works were likely to have been lost forever, but they suspected that others, perhaps many others, were hidden away in dark places, not only in Italy, but across the Alps. The prime hunting grounds were the libraries of old monasteries. For centuries, monasteries had been virtually the only institutions that cared about books.
Monks spent hours upon hours copying text by hand in the scriptorium, under the direction of the chief librarian. And the scriptorium had strict rules. There was no access to non-scribes. Silence was kept at all times. Scribes were not given a choice in the books they copied. They did not work at night, as candlelight was not permitted near the books. Standard copiers would use pens, ink and penknives. Some worked with finer tools, rulers, awls, fine metal pointed pens, reading frames, page weights. Some manuscripts were illuminated, in which monks would spend countless hours crafting with specialized tools. The work was hard and long, and on some manuscripts you can still see notations from the monks in the margins. Thank God it will be dark soon. Now I've written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink.
Monks were strictly forbidden to change what they thought were mistakes in the text they were copying. They could correct only their own slips of the pen by carefully scraping off the ink with a razor and repairing the spot with a mixture of milk, cheese, and lime, the medieval version of our own production for whiting out mistakes. There was no crumpling up the page and starting fresh. Monastic scribes had been forced to copy everything exactly as it appeared before their eyes, even those things that made no sense. There were a certain number of abbots and of monastic librarians who treasured not only the parchment, but also the pagan works written on them. Steeped in classical literature, some believed that they could rifle its treasures without contamination. But over generations, as a substantial Christian literature was created, it became less easy to make such an argument. Between the 6th century and in the middle of the 8th century, Greek and Latin classics virtually ceased to be copied at all. What had begun as an active campaign to forget, a pious attack on pagan ideas, had evolved into actual forgetting. The classics had been reduced to the condition of mute things, sheets of parchment, stitched together, covered with unread words.
It was only because of the high value placed upon parchment that the writings of the ancients were kept alive at all. And, as the humanist book hunter knew, even strong material was no guarantee of survival. Working with knives, brushes and rags, monks often carefully washed away the old writings and wrote in their place the text that they were instructed by their superiors to copy. If the original ink proved tenacious, it could still be possible to make out the traces of the texts that were written over. A unique 4th century copy of Cicero's On the Republic remained visible beneath a 7th century copy of St. Augustine. The sole surviving copy of Seneca's book on friendship was deciphered beneath an Old Testament, inscribed in the late 6th century. These strange, layered manuscripts, called palimpsests, have served as a source of several major works from the ancient past that would not otherwise be known. And it's the hoarding and copying of ancient manuscripts where things become quite interesting. It all centers around a crew of literary men, the book hunters, and a specific man named Poggio Bracciolini.
All writings which are commonly thought to be old are in fact, with certain exceptions, supposititious, and the fabrication of an unprincipled crew of literary men. They were bound to forge almost countless literary monuments. A vast number of volumes was prepared, because the wicked forgers knew that the more there were, the more difficult it would be to unravel the fraud. They were forged in the 14th century, but they could scarce be read until they were printed, and this was mostly done in the 16th century. During the close of the 14th century, throughout the 15th, and at the commencement of the 16th, books were constantly being recovered under distressingly suspicious circumstances. Exactly the Roman author that was wanted turned up, and always for a certainty that Roman author for whom the highest price had been offered. For the discovery of manuscripts of the ancient classics, which when long looked for and not found, were usually from too tempting reward, which was a fortune forged by some unscrupulous writer of Latin. A little band of men lived in Rome. All were famous for their abilities. Poggio Bracciolini possessed the plastic power that makes the forger, writing in a great variety of styles and manners. The Scaligerian chronology of Rome is constructed upon a most flimsy foundation indeed.
The historical scenario of monks preserving texts in guarded libraries, and the process of handwritten transcription and copying on parchment is enough to make one suspicious. At minimum, information could and would have been lost in translation and transcription. A larger problem is the ideology of religion. Would a religious order really preserve the history of the pagan ancient world with fidelity and non-bias? The scriptoriums throw into sharp focus the unreliability that characterizes Europe's pre-Renaissance handwritten history. But the words of Jean Ardois, John Wilson Ross, and Anatoly Fomenko take this unreliability into the realm of conspiracy, as they introduce the concept of mass forgery. Scholars have written extensively on the matter of literary forgery, some of the more famous examples being the infamous letter of Prester John and the donation of Constantine. And not only were these forgeries accepted by contemporary society as legitimate, but they also went on to change the course of history. For a lie is like a seed. As Umberto Eco writes in regard to the donation, without that document, without a profound belief in its authenticity, European history would have followed a different course. No conflict over investitures, no mortal struggle for the Holy Roman Empire, no temporal power of the popes, no slap at Agnani, and also no Sistine Chapel. The donation of Constantine was copied and translated by hand on parchment extensively during the Middle Ages. It is startling to consider just how easy it may have been for monks and others to forge handwritten documents and ascribe them to earlier dates in the historical timeline. That the monastic scriptoriums may have, perhaps, functioned as forges for producing mass forgeries. The world that Poggio Bracciolini and his associates, the book hunters, inhabited was one of a burgeoning new age, and what has latterly been termed the Renaissance. The humanists were casting off the shackles of what was then perceived as the dark ages of their immediate religious past, and looking back to their more ancient history with wonder and the longing for a lost world. A lost world that they believed was more technologically and socially advanced than their current one. And providing that Ardois and others are correct, that a good portion of manuscripts documenting ancient history were fabricated during the Renaissance, then the question remains, why? Did this band of humanists, in their longing for a lost civilization, just let their imagination get the better of them? Or were they just greedy, fortune-seeking individuals? For as Ross and the correspondence of the time tells us, there was a tempting reward, which was a fortune, offered by society's elite for finding lost manuscripts. But while fantasy and greed, and not to mention fame, would have certainly driven the book hunters, when we look closer at the life of Poggio Bracciolini, something bigger and more concerning surfaces. Poggio wasn't just a learned man with a thirst for lost history. Throughout his life, he moved alongside the upper echelons of society. He had served 7 popes through his apostolic secretary role. And not only that, but he was also excellent friends with and receiving patronage from the Medici family, one of the most powerful banking families in history. And when looking at all the humanists, from Petrarch and Boccaccio to Poggio himself, they were all entwined with ultra-elite nobles, like the Orsinis or Medicis. These are the same Medicis that produced 4 popes, countless dukes, and whose bloodline ended up running through various royal families in Spain, France, and Britain. Poggio was, as William Meehan writes, Cosimo Medici's chief book scout. Medici's involvement in the book hunters' enterprise surpassed meagre funding. He was financing all their trips. He employed countless copyists to transcribe manuscripts and founded the first public library in Florence, which specialized in texts from antiquity and the humanist movement.
The great thing with him and his companions was, when they could not find to forge, all they had to ascertain was simply which ancient Roman was particularly wanted and would fetch the highest price. And as the band consisted of men of genius, of different tastes or faculties, poetical, historical, or narrative, philosophical, grammatical, or critical, and scientific or mathematical, if the reward was sufficiently munificent to pay for the time and labor, the highly valued work that was wanted, no matter to what department of literature it belonged, was sure to turn up, sooner or later. And if the man who was to forge was not in the proper mood of inspiration for the business, some other fabricated writer was put forward.
For Ardois, Ross, Fomenko, and others, the immediate and obvious signs pointing to mass forgery of pre-Renaissance texts are the parallels between the events documented in those texts with contemporary events of the end of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance itself. They also all highlight the irregularities when it comes to the Latin and Greek in which they were written. In the French language, we see the greatest changes in the course of 500 years, but in the Greek fathers and historians, there is not the slightest vestige of a change in the language during an alleged period of 1,500 years. All use the same dialect and the same syntax. In his investigation into Poggio's potential forgery of the Annals of Tacitus, a key work for our modern understanding of the history of the Roman Empire, Ross presents a multitude of arguments, including countless errors and peculiarities relating to its literary composition and its Latin, how various coins and monuments directly contradict the narrative, geographical errors, resemblances to Poggio's own writing, the anomalies between the Annals and other ancient texts. As Ross states, the author of the Annals knew more about prominent individuals in Rome than was known to their distinguished contemporaneous countrymen. And finally, anachronistic references to Poggio's era and the parallels between accounts in the history and the 1400s. Just like Ardois and Fomenko, Ross notes that heaps of passages in the Annals read like incidents in the 15th century. And Ross wasn't alone in his cynicism. Even French satirist Voltaire suspected the Annals were a forgery. For Ross, however, Ardois is extreme in his designation of almost all texts predating the Renaissance as forgeries. Nobody at the present day considers what he said about the literary monuments of antiquity worthy of the slightest attention. And this is because Ardois was arguing that all of antiquity was forged and fabricated to discredit the truth of the Catholic Church. Ross's criticism of Ardois would no doubt have extended to Fomenko too, in his nationalistic attempt to discredit all pre-Renaissance texts and claim a huge cover-up of a vast unified Russian empire. For Ross, the deception is trickier and more nuanced. He acknowledges that it is likely that many Greek texts from antiquity are real, and it was from those that the Latin ones, the history of the Romans, was invented. He agrees with Ardois when he states one is almost inclined to give Father Ardois credit for being quite right when he expressed as his belief that perhaps not more than 2 or 3 of the ancient Latin classics were really written by the old Romans. And this is the genius of the forgery operation and how it was successful in the first place, because the truth and the lies, the real and the forged are mixed in with each other so much that it is very difficult to evidence. The forgery is anything but plain and palpable. Nay, it is wonderfully obscure and monstrously difficult. And providing they are correct, How was a vast conspiracy of forgery like this even possible in the first place, or pulled off convincingly? Ardois outlines a potential process clearly. Firstly, before the printing press became widespread and the norm, the general public did not have easy access to these manuscripts. Although they were forged in the 14th century, they could scarce be read until they were printed, and this was mostly done in the 16th century. Secondly, it was necessary that the book should be written on parchment, so that they might keep up the lie of great antiquity and be longer preserved. Handwritten parchment not only allowed forgers to make manuscripts appear older than they were, but also allowed various copies, whether prepared in monasteries or by Cosimo Medici's copyists, to be produced, predated, and then subsequently hidden in various locations. But that means there would have been a diverse amount of players involved. Wouldn't someone speak out? Especially in monastic circles where religious piety was prioritized. Describing Renaissance Italy after his first visit to Rome, Luther said, "Everything is permitted there except to be an honest man." And Poggio himself captures this society of hypocrisy well when describing his visit to the Baths of Baden in 1416. Abbots, monks, friars and priests comported themselves with more licentiousness than the laity, laid aside all thoughts of religion, and sometimes bathed with women, whose hair they decked with ribbons and wreaths of flowers. Given this account, it would not be absurd to assume that many abbots and monks would commit acts of impiety, accept bribery money, or were even compromised by others. Thirdly, and most importantly, the genius of the lie relies on the forgers creating a web of intertextuality. Intertextuality is when one text references another text. The pestiferous gang joined forces in the writing of history, hence they very often copy one another, and they overwhelmed readers with the number of books, and so made it harder to believe that the suspicion of fraud and falsehood was well founded. A key example of intertextuality is the alleged work of Quintilian, whose texts reference many other writers, such as Marcus Pacuvius and Cornelius Severus in passing. Another example is the Annals of Tacitus. Modern scholars dismiss Ross's claims that Poggio forged the Annals because Book 15 of the Annals is referenced in Giovanni Boccaccio's commentary on Dante, which was written before Poggio was born. And it's true, both Boccaccio's text and the Annals align. But, according to Ross, Ardois and others, this intertextuality is the genius of the lie. Although writing before Poggio was born, Boccaccio belonged to the first generation of book hunters in Italy. And if we entertain the idea that they were running a wholesale forgery operation, then it would be in the forger's interest to leave references to other, yet to be discovered texts as to ensure the longevity of the fraudulent business, creating opportunities for fellow and future book hunters to generate more forgeries. It would also work as a perfect tactic in ensuring that the texts were never discovered to be forgeries, as they were referenced elsewhere and earlier in time. And if correct, this dedication to carefully crafted intertextuality really is the success of the forgery, for it prevents any forgery from being conclusively proven. Unless undeniable evidence is presented demonstrating ancient texts to be forged, intertextuality will always keep the majority of scholars fixed to the idea that the texts are authentic, even though academia acknowledges that there were indeed forgeries during this period, such as Consolatio, a text allegedly written by the ancient Cicero that was discovered by humanist and book hunter Carolus Sigonius in 1583. On his deathbed, Carolus admitted that he forged the text, and it is now widely accepted as a fake. Ross finds it highly unconvincing that these ancient texts would have been so mistreated and misplaced over the centuries.
It's almost unbelievable that such people would treat them as swine treat pearls, spurn them, not keep them in libraries, but throw them away as useless lumber into cellars, pits, dark holes, dirty passages, dry wells. And who would think of looking for books in such places, he asks. And yet it was precisely in such places that the book hunters looked for the books that they wanted. What is still stranger, they always found in such queer places the exact books they were in search of. When they recovered books in the monastery of St. Gall, the books were not found where they ought to have been, on account of their excellence, on the shelves of the library, but where slugs and toads are more frequently looked for, and found then books and manuscripts, in an exceedingly dirty and dark dungeon, at the bottom of a tower. The circumstances surrounding the discovery of many alleged ancient lost texts is highly suspicious and coincidental. More often than not, they were found in darkness, in a blind dungeon, in a dirty dungeon, in dismal dungeons.
The many coincidences, conveniences, and circumstances are very suspicious. And when looking closer at the correspondence between Poggio and his partner Niccolò Nicolai, we find suggestion that they were, indeed, up to no good. Under the patronage of Cosimo Medici, Nicolai, a fellow humanist and copyist, was responsible for building up a personal library of 800 manuscripts, which now reside in the Medici-founded Laurentian Library. Detailing the years leading up to the so-called rediscovery of the Annals of Tacitus, Ross informs us that Poggio, then a resident in Rome, began to forge a work with the intention of palming it off upon the world as written by an ancient Roman. As one of Poggio's early biographers recounts, in 1422 Piero Lamberteschi offered Poggio a situation, the nature of which is not precisely known, but which was probably that of a public professor in one of the Italian universities. The situation, the nature of which was unknown, and which would earn Poggio in 3 years 500 gold sequins, was, according to Ross, to forge a lost text, most likely the Annals. As he explains, Nicolai was at the bottom of this, advising his friend to undertake the task and frequently corresponding by letter discussing the matter. And while this early biographer speculates that the offer was to take up a position as a public professor in a university, Poggio's letters to Nicolai suggest the offer was of a different nature. Poggio writes, "I like the occupation to which he has invited me, and I hope I shall be able to produce something worth reading." But as Ross points out, professors in those days did not collect their lectures and publish them. They could not then produce something worth reading. Poggio also writes that if I were to see that I should get that which our friend Piero expects, I would go not only to the end of Europe, but as far as to the wilds of Tartary. Again reinforcing that the task was to produce something that would reward him with a small fortune, to retire and travel far and wide. In another letter to Nicolai, dated 10th of June 1422, Poggio writes, "I want you to have no distrust. Give me the leisure and the time for writing that history, and I will do something you approve. When I reflect on the merits of the ancient writers of history, I recoil with fear from the undertaking." And on the 8th of October 1423, Poggio writes, "Beginnings of any kind being arduous and difficult, what the ancients did pleasantly, quickly, and easily was to him troublesome, tedious, and burdensome." No mention of writing that history occurs again in correspondence between Poggio and Nicolai, but a few years later there is a suggestion that rumours had got abroad regarding what was transpiring between the two. And Poggio writes to Nicolai reassuring him that when Tacitus came, he would keep it a secrecy, that he knew all the tittle-tattle that was going on, but have no fear, for that not a syllable should escape him. If Poggio was just about to receive the lost histories written by Tacitus, Why, Ross asks, would you want to keep it secret? Wouldn't it be better to make noise of it, abroad immediately, and as publicly as could be, so that it might be known to a wide circle of book collectors, and as large a sum got for it as could be obtained? And what exactly was that history which Poggio was trying to write and feeling pressured to match the style of the ancient writers? All of this suggests that not only were Poggio and Nicolai involved in secretive business pertaining to writing, but that they were extremely careful as to not specifically reference the particulars of their business in correspondence. It has all the markings of a sophisticated criminal operation, one very aware that it must leave minimal trace, for letters could be intercepted back then. Any hint at forgery would ruin their scheme and reputation. But more importantly, this kind of caution when it comes to private letters suggests that perhaps they were working with a greater foresight in mind, perhaps anticipating how their letters may be interpreted by future historians. Poggio and the book hunters would have no doubt been motivated by money. But why were the Medicis, one of the richest banking families in Italy, financing this whole operation? Could they have been deliberately forging history with the foresight of future generations in mind? They've certainly covered their tracks, erased all conclusive evidence to the point where forgery cannot be proven or disproved, and all that remains is an abundance of suspicious coincidences and circumstances. The lies that resist exposure are the most troublesome. When you know someone is lying, but you cannot irrefutably prove it. You feel it in your core, but it is your instinct against their word. What would that sort of lie do to the course of history and time? Could our pre-Renaissance history have been forged? If we consider this notion, that even a small fraction of the texts from antiquity were fabricated during the Renaissance, then the timeline begins to distort and collapse under the weight of unreliability, and the certainty surrounding written history ends right here. And to seriously consider this means to play a dangerous game, because it creates a boundless historical absence. What's to stop a nefarious entity from forging and filling this absence with whatever fantasy they see fit and that serves their own agenda? And perhaps that's what the book hunters were doing, filling a great absence with an ideal vision of Rome that never existed, all for the purpose of serving the political and technological agenda of an obscure entity. And what entity? Orsini, Medici, the Italian nobility, Shadow Rome. And if the books were forged, then where are all the legitimate pre-Renaissance texts? Why is there an absence here in the first place? Because, as Victor Hugo tells us, before the invention of the printing press, architecture was the primary mode of language. Our ancestors wrote their chronicles, stories, histories in stone. The invention of the printed book destroyed this method of memory.
But in the current digitized world, trivial information is accumulating every second, preserved in all its triteness, never fading, always accessible. All this junk data, preserved in an unfiltered state, growing at an alarming rate.
It will only slow down social progress, reduce the rate of evolution. What we propose to do is not to control content, but to create context.
It's our responsibility as rulers. Just as in genetics, unnecessary information and memory must be filtered out to stimulate the evolution of the species. Who else could wade through the sea of garbage you people produce, retrieve valuable truths, and even interpret their meaning for later generations?
That's what it means to create context.
We are on the cusp of a burgeoning new age that will be run by AI technology. AI technology that already has the capability to forge and fabricate the historical narrative. It is only a matter of time before groups once again trifle with the historical record for their own gain. Let's play our own hand at this dangerous game. Could there exist another lead outside of writing that suggests Roman history is a forgery? It's time to put forth a hypothesis and look closer at a very important book that was rediscovered during the Renaissance and its relationship to this kind of classical architecture. We need to go to Florence and examine this, for it is this dome that has come to shape all our histories in its own particular way and offers us clues as to why it was perhaps necessary to forge history.
I need to find out where I am before I reach the stars. Yeah, before I step on Mars.